cursed heirloom. I'll admit, I didn't know my grandmother, Margaret, very well. She was the kind of woman people in town spoke about in hushed tones, their words laced with awe and suspicion. A witch, some called her, though not to her face. Others said she was just eccentric, but when she died, they all whispered the same thing: her death wasn't natural. When I received the letter from her estate, I was surprised to learn she had left me something, a peculiar antique mirror. I wasn't particularly close to her, but curiosity got the better of me. When the delivery van pulled up to my modest house in the suburbs, the driver struggled to carry the oversized object into my living room. It was beautiful in a way that felt wrong. The frame was wrought iron, painted black, and carved with serpentine figures twisting around ancient symbols I didn't recognize. The glass shimmered unnaturally, even in the dim afternoon light streaming through my blinds. For some reason, it made my stomach churn. "What an eyesore," my best friend, Lily, said when she came over that evening. She tilted her head, her strawberry blonde curls falling to one side as she scrutinized it. But, cool in a creepy way. "It's very, you, Emma." "Gee, thanks," I replied with a laugh, though I felt uneasy. After she left, I stared at the mirror for a long time. Its surface was flawless, but when I leaned in close, I swore my reflection didn't quite match my movements. The longer I looked, the more distorted it seemed. My face stretched, then shrank, and then it wasn't even my face anymore. I stumbled back, heart pounding. "Stop it," I told myself. "You're imagining things." That night, I dreamt of shadows. Whispers. Cold hands brushing my skin. I woke drenched in sweat, the faint echo of laughter ringing in my ears. The strange occurrences started small. At first, it was just the whispers, faint and distant, like a forgotten radio frequency. They seemed to come from the direction of the mirror, but when I'd approach it, silence. Then came the visions. Faces I didn't recognize, men, women, children. Their eyes wide with terror, mouths moving in silent screams. They flickered in the mirror for just a moment before disappearing. I'd blink, and my own reflection would stare back at me, pale and shaking. I tried to brush it off as stress. Work at the bookstore had been chaotic lately, and I hadn't been sleeping well. But then Lily went missing. She'd come over for movie night, bringing popcorn and her trademark energy that always filled my quiet house. Halfway through the movie, she got up to use the bathroom. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I called out to her, but there was no response. I checked the bathroom, empty. The front door was locked, her car still in the driveway, but she was gone. The police were sympathetic but unhelpful. "Maybe she left on foot," they suggested. "It happens more often than you'd think." But I knew better. I felt it in my bones, the mirror had something to do with her disappearance. Desperate for answers, I began digging into my grandmother's past. Her journals, old photos, and the cryptic notes she'd left behind painted a chilling picture. Margaret Blake had been deeply involved in the occult. She'd performed rituals, summoned entities, and, most disturbingly, crafted a mirror as a vessel for something she'd referred to only as the Watcher. The more I read, the more I realized the mirror wasn't just a cursed object. It was a gateway. A bridge between our world and somewhere else. Somewhere dark. My best friend wasn't the only one to vanish. Next, it was Matt, my coworker from the bookstore. He dropped by to borrow a book and made the mistake of pausing in front of the mirror. I'd turned away for just a moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. Panic gripped me. How was I going to explain this? People would think I was insane. So I said nothing. I didn't even call the police this time. Instead, I poured all my energy into deciphering my grandmother's notes. It didn't take long for the entity to make itself known. One night, as I stared into the mirror, the glass rippled like water. A figure emerged, tall, gaunt, and wrapped in shadows. Its face was a void, a black hole that seemed to pull at my very soul. "Emma," it whispered, its voice like dead leaves scraping across pavement. "You belong to me now." I stumbled back, clutching my chest. "What do you want?" I screamed. "They are mine," it replied. "And soon, you will be too." Its laughter echoed long after it vanished, leaving me trembling on the floor. I knew then that there was no escaping this. Not without a fight. Determined to end this nightmare, I tracked down one of my grandmother's old friends, a woman named Evelyn Moore. She lived on the outskirts of town in a house crammed with talismans, herbs, and dusty tomes. "You should have destroyed that mirror the moment you got it," she said when I told her everything. "How?" I asked. "It's not exactly something you can toss in the trash." Evelyn's expression darkened. "Destroying it won't be easy. The Watcher is bound to it, but it's also its anchor. You'll need to sever the connection by performing a ritual, one your grandmother started but never finished." She handed me a book filled with runes and incantations. "But be warned," she added. "If you fail, the Watcher won't just take you. It will consume everything." I spent days preparing, gathering the necessary items and memorizing the incantation. When the night of the ritual arrived, I felt the weight of every soul the mirror had claimed pressing down on me. As I began the chant, the mirror's surface boiled and churned. The Watcher emerged, its form more solid than ever. "You cannot banish me," it hissed. "I am eternal." But I kept going, my voice rising over its growls. Light filled the room, so bright it hurt, and the mirror cracked, splintering into 1,000 shards. The Watcher let out a deafening scream as its form dissolved into the void. When it was over, the house was silent. The mirror was nothing but dust. But as I looked around, I realized something horrifying. The faces of Lily and Matt stared back at me from the shattered pieces, their mouths open in silent cries. I buried the shards in the woods behind my house, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the faces of the lost haunt me still. Every night, I hear their whispers, begging me to free them. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the window, I see the faint outline of serpents twisting behind me, waiting for their chance to return. I thought the nightmare was over, but I was wrong. The voices didn't stop, and the shadows grew darker in the corners of my home. They whispered names I didn't know, cried out in languages I couldn't understand. Some nights, I'd wake to the sensation of someone standing over me, only to find my room empty. One morning, as I tried to shake off another restless night, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think it's over, but it's only just begun." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Could it be Evelyn? Or was it something far worse? I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. The voice on the other end wasn't human, it was a low, guttural growl that made my stomach churn. I hung up, heart pounding. Desperate, I decided to visit Evelyn again. Her house was exactly as I remembered it, cluttered with ancient artifacts and steeped in an oppressive stillness. But when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. Peering through the window, I saw the place in disarray. Books were strewn across the floor, shelves toppled, and a faint smell of sulfur lingered in the air. Evelyn was gone. I sifted through the wreckage of Evelyn's home, searching for clues. Amid the chaos, I found a notebook. Its pages were filled with frantic scrawls about the Watcher, the mirror, and something called the seventh seal. According to Evelyn's notes, the Watcher's destruction had only weakened its hold, not ended it. The entity's essence had scattered, seeking a new vessel. My stomach sank as I realized the truth. It was me. I was the new anchor. One page caught my eye. It described a ritual, a final one that could sever the connection for good. But the ingredients were rare, and the instructions warned of dire consequences if performed incorrectly. The ritual required a soul tether, something precious that bound me to this world. I thought of my mother's locket, the one she'd given me before she passed. It would have to do. The first item on the list was grave dirt from a restless soul. I shuddered at the thought but knew of an old, abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town. The place was overgrown with weeds and thick fog that seemed to cling to the air. As I dug into the cold earth, the wind howled, carrying with it faint cries that made my skin crawl. Next was a vial of water from a cursed spring. Evelyn's notes directed me to a secluded forest where a stream was said to run black under the moonlight. When I arrived, the water glistened like oil, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I filled the vial quickly, my hands shaking, and fled without looking back. The final component was blood, my own. I pricked my finger, letting the droplets soak into the locket. It glowed faintly, as if absorbing my essence. The preparation was complete, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The night of the ritual, the air was heavy, and the house felt alive with tension. I drew the symbols on the floor, lit the candles, and began chanting. The air grew colder with each word, frost creeping along the walls. Halfway through, the shadows in the room began to move. They coalesced into a form, tall, skeletal, and draped in tattered darkness. The Watcher was back, and it was furious. "You cannot escape me," it growled, its void-like face twisting with rage. "You are mine." "Not anymore," I shouted, holding the glowing locket high. The light burned the creature's form, and it shrieked, a sound that rattled the very walls. I finished the incantation, pouring every ounce of my will into the final words. The locket blazed with an otherworldly light, and the Watcher's form began to dissolve. Its screams grew weaker until they faded entirely, leaving only silence. When it was over, I collapsed, the room spinning around me. The mirror shards, which I thought I had buried, now lay scattered across the floor, glowing faintly. The faces of Lily and Matt stared up at me, their expressions frozen in anguish. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. But something was wrong. The locket, once warm in my hand, had turned icy cold. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I realized the cost of the ritual. My soul was fractured, pieces of it drawn into the mirror's remains. I could feel myself fading, my connection to the world slipping away. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of whispers, not from the mirror, but from within me. The Watcher was gone, but its mark remained, etched into my very being. Weeks passed, and life returned to a fragile semblance of normalcy. The mirror's shards were gone, scattered by the ritual. But every so often, I'd catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, a shadow here, a flicker there. The whispers hadn't stopped, and neither had the nightmares. I'd become the new anchor, not for the Watcher, but for the souls it had claimed. They followed me, tethered by the ritual. And as much as I wanted to free them, I knew that doing so might unleash something far worse. Now, every mirror, every window, every puddle feels like a doorway. I avoid them when I can, but deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before the darkness finds a way back in. And when it does, I'll be waiting. The silence in my home became a constant reminder of what I had lost, and what I had gained. Days bled into nights, each one darker than the last. The faces in the mirror shards haunted me, and the voices, oh, the voices. They didn't just whisper anymore, they pleaded, screamed, and sometimes sang lullabies that made my skin crawl. I knew I couldn't stay like this. The knowledge that I was the anchor for these trapped souls gnawed at me, but Evelyn's notes were clear: severing the tether entirely might tear the fabric of this world. The risk was too great. Still, I couldn't accept that this was my life now. Somewhere in my grandmother's journals, I hoped to find a clue, anything to bring peace to the restless spirits without unleashing chaos. One rainy evening, as I combed through the dusty pages, a passage caught my eye. The Watcher's seal is one of 7. Breaking it invites the others. Binding it passes the burden. Only through balance may the cycle end. Balance. The word stuck with me. What did it mean? And what were the others? My grandmother had clearly known more than she'd let on, and the idea of other entities like the Watcher sent a chill down my spine. If I was the anchor for one, what would happen if the rest were unleashed? The journals referenced a series of ancient artifacts, each tied to a different entity. The mirror had been one, but the others were scattered across the world. My grandmother had spent her life collecting them, though she'd never intended to destroy them. Instead, she'd sought to study them, to understand their purpose. I found a map tucked into one of the journals. It marked locations where the other seals might be hidden: a decayed church in Eastern Europe, an abandoned lighthouse on a rocky shore, a deep cavern in the American Southwest. Each place felt impossibly far and impossibly dangerous. But if I wanted to free myself, to free the souls trapped with me, I had no choice. I had to find these seals and learn how to restore the balance my grandmother spoke of. The first stop was the decayed church, nestled in the mountains of Romania. It took weeks to arrange travel and gather the supplies I'd need. When I arrived, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The church had long been abandoned, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of time. Inside, I found carvings similar to those on the mirror's frame. The serpentine figures twisted around each other, forming an unbroken circle. At the center of the altar lay a blackened relic, a small, cracked chalice. As I reached for it, the air grew colder, and a low growl echoed through the empty hall. "Who dares disturb this place?" a voice rasped. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. It wasn't the Watcher, but something just as old, just as menacing. I clutched my mother's locket, the faint warmth of it giving me strength. "I seek balance," I said, my voice trembling. The figure laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Balance comes at a cost. Are you willing to pay it?" I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes." The creature lunged, and the world went black. When I woke, the chalice was in my hands, and the church was eerily silent. My body ached, and a fresh scar ran across my palm. Blood seeped into the chalice, though I had no memory of spilling it. The air felt lighter, as if something had lifted, but I knew this was only the beginning. The journey had marked me, just as the Watcher had. As I stepped out of the church, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just from the trapped souls, they came from the chalice itself. 6 more, the voices said. 6 more to find. The road ahead was long, and the darkness was far from defeated. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. If I could find the other seals, if I could endure their trials, maybe, just maybe, I could break the cycle. And maybe, one day, I'd finally be free. The second seal lay in a forgotten lighthouse perched on the edge of a jagged cliff. The trip was grueling, long flights, restless nights in dingy motels, and a hike through relentless rain. When I arrived, the lighthouse loomed above me, its skeletal frame barely holding together against the crashing waves below. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with salt and decay. The spiral staircase leading up seemed endless, its iron steps slick with algae. As I climbed, the whispers returned, faint but insistent. They weren't from the chalice this time but from the walls themselves. At the top, I found a weathered lantern sitting on a pedestal. Its glass was fogged, and inside, a dim light flickered as if it were alive. As I reached for it, the room began to spin. The windows shattered, and a gale-force wind swept through, carrying with it the scent of the sea and something far fouler. "Leave," a voice growled, deep and guttural. A massive shadow formed in the corner of the room, its eyes glowing like embers. It lunged at me, forcing me to the ground. Desperation overtook me. I clutched the chalice, whispering fragments of the incantations I'd memorized. The light within the lantern grew brighter, blinding the shadow. It howled in pain before dissolving into the wind. I took the lantern and descended the stairs, feeling the weight of another seal in my hands. The whispers from the chalice and the lantern harmonized, a haunting melody that promised more trials to come. Months passed. Each seal demanded a greater toll. By the time I reached the final one, I was no longer the person I had been. My body bore scars from battles I barely survived, and my soul felt frayed, tethered to forces I barely understood. The last seal brought me back to my grandmother's home. Beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, I found a hidden compartment containing a small, ornate box. Its carvings matched those of the mirror and the other artifacts. As I touched it, the air in the room grew heavy, and the watcher's voice returned. "You cannot end this," it hissed. "You are the anchor now. Without you, the cycle will collapse." The room filled with shadows, each one a fragment of the entities I had faced. They circled me, their voices overlapping in a deafening cacophony. But amid the chaos, I remembered my grandmother's words: balance. I placed each artifact in a circle, aligning their symbols. The chalice, the lantern, the box, and the others glowed faintly, their energies intertwining. I began the incantation, my voice steady despite the storm of darkness around me. The shadows screamed, clawing at the edges of the circle, but they couldn't break through. The artifacts pulsed with light, growing brighter and brighter until everything went white. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The artifacts were gone, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. The mirror shards no longer reflected twisted faces, and the voices had fallen silent. I stumbled outside, the morning sun warming my face for the first time in what felt like years. The burden was gone. The Watcher and its kin were sealed once more, and I was free. But freedom came with a price. The faces of those I'd lost, Lily, Matt, and countless others, still haunted me. Their fates were sealed with the artifacts, their souls forever part of the balance I'd restored. I returned to my quiet life, but I was no longer the same. The scars remained, both visible and unseen. And though the artifacts were gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cycle might one day begin again. For now, though, the world was safe. And I would carry the memory of the darkness, so others wouldn't have to.